another night of attacks. So let's get to the next panel discussion. And this one is called Working to Mold a Common Cultural Sensibility. And I wanted everybody to notice the suggested topic was the Ukrainian worldview. The Germans used to have a word called Weltanschauung. That's a sense of of how Ukrainians might view the world in the aesthetic, intellectual, but also the moral and socio-political. So when I asked my dear friend, I just want to say that the two individuals that are here are amongst the individuals that were in the original group that put together the original Roundtable series, and have been with us throughout this entire period. In fact, Robert and Nadia, I just wanted to give a special to them. They, more than anybody else, can really talk about this issue because they have been molding a kind of westward look, not only at the level of political elites, but at the level of civil society, with an enormous amount of work that they did with things like the leadership program with the Library of Congress and so on. And so I don't know of anybody who can speak to this issue more than those that will be on this panel. So Robert, I think I'm going to leave it with you at this point, okay?
Thank you, Walter. Thank you for having us. Thank you all who are here listening. We're talking about molding. Civil society is molding. Do I start over?
Yes.
Talking about molding, civil society has been molding Ukraine since before independence. Civil society has been ahead in pushing for independence. Civil society has been ahead of every government that Ukraine has had, demanding things that it hasn't gotten. Civil society is now fighting a war. Everyone in that society. The more exposure, and a lot of non-Ukrainians wondered why Ukraine didn't quickly change the way Poland did. Well, Poland wasn't behind the Iron Curtain. There was exposure in Poland to Western ideas and activities. Ukraine was sealed off. But since that wall has come down, people from Ukraine have traveled west, and certainly the young people have seen what they wanted in their society and what they haven't yet gotten. This war has put the people of Ukraine in a position that they have to fight the war of independence they did not have to fight in 1991. And the people have united. Civil society has united. I would make the point that Nadia was one of three, I guess, non-Ukrainians invited to a conference in Salzburg in July. I went along and tagged in and ended up being part of it. But about 50 people, the conference was Ukraine's civil society at war, at the turning point of war. A week-long intense conference. Everything I thought about Ukraine's civil society was confirmed in those 5 days. If you came up with a subject, and it came up early, reconstruction to Ukraine's civil society, those 50 representatives, has nothing to do with roads, bridges, buildings. Civil society's idea of reconstruction of Ukraine is building Ukraine and Ukraine's values the way they want it to be, and it hasn't been. A rule of law that is a genuine rule of law, a moral fabric that is part and parcel of everything in the culture. That's what they were talking about. That's what they wanted to talk about, and that's what they want to build. The physical things will come, but they want what they've been trying to get for decades. And I thought that's very encouraging. It's, my view, the right way to go. And you know, this last panel, Kyle made a comment that is so very true, but we, Nadia and I, just recently have had an experience that just confirmed that. You know, before the war, before independence, there were all kinds of people that their backgrounds were Ukraine, but they said they were from Russia, or, you know, they didn't focus on Ukraine. Well, there are a lot of people after independence that didn't really, I mean, they voted for independence, but it wasn't in there 100% in the fabric of the. We met, we're now starting to work with a very brilliant lawyer working for our government. His family left Kharkiv a number of years ago. Jewish Ukrainians that just didn't really identify as Ukrainians. I mean, they said they were from Ukraine, but Ukrainians. February 24th and since, you will not find a family that is more Ukrainian, more devoted, more passionate about its freedom than this family. Putin has done something that nobody else could do. He has united the people of Ukraine into a total uniform people in so many ways. Others have talked about, Kyle certainly talked about the tenacity and so forth. We had a meeting with the former governor of Kharkiv last week, Kherson last week, and he said something that now I've heard 3 or 4 other people long distance say. We would rather live under the artillery shelling than occupation. These people are going to win this war. They're going to win it because they want their freedom and their country. I think I've probably said enough at this point. We have a speaker who has been taken out by artillery, destroying his electricity, so he can't come on from Ukraine. And now I have a very unique situation. I'm supposed to introduce my wife. I could go on for a long time about this, but I won't. She's the co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. She is, we've done a lot of things in the 31 years we've been on the ground in Ukraine. And as many good people we've had, they would all say, among other things, that every idea for every program, especially the most unique ones that we didn't think made any sense or couldn't happen, were Nadia's ideas. So I'm going to stop there, Nadia. You have the mic.
Thank you. A couple of corrections, yes.
I will say, I had a speech yesterday to 150 professional women in Arlington. She was in the audience and I hadn't spoken for very long before. Can I add something? And so there was a back and forth for the rest of the program, which apparently was quite entertaining. But
So I've been reminded, I guess, that not only am I speaking to this room, but also on Facebook. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more judicious in how I express myself and not get into too much trouble. Yeah, I think it wouldn't surprise any of you that I'll be a little contrarian. including, and I think Robert has already referenced this about the use of the word to mold. I think that the people of Ukraine are molding their advances in civil society and building of a democratic nation. And we have been privileged to be witnesses to that. I'm going to take off on a few things that have been said earlier. I guess the Archbishop is not here. But one of the things that he mentioned, and I think we've all have appreciated, people were saying, so surprised about the fact that the people of Ukraine are as resilient and determined as they have been. And he also mentioned, I guess, that Friedman has called this I forget the war of digital, whatever, wired. Okay. And there's something important to this, and I don't think time is going to take a little, but we'll need more time to really fully appreciate it. But the reason it's this time, the people of Ukraine are finally being able to tell the world about who they are. And the reason for that is being that previous wars, right? Historians write about it, or even current other wars, you'll have politicians telling you about what's going on in the war, or even the media is giving you little clips of their reporting of certain wars. This is the first time ever that a war is being communicated directly to the people of the world by the people of Ukraine. The media has been a microphone and allowing people of every possible group, class, or however you want to say. And what has happened? There has been a worldwide, if you want to say, revolution of dignity or Maidan. The people of the world have responded, right? The outpouring of support way ahead of their various respective governments. And this is just such a, in some ways, a blessing that finally those of us who have known the character of the people of Ukraine are now seeing that fact that the world is not going to be able to see it for themselves. The other thing that the Archbishop talked about, and several of us have been talking about, like, how is some of these things happening? You know, there's this sort of self-organization that seems to be a characteristic of Ukrainian people. And we can talk different examples. The DP camps right after World War II. Our immigration that came to various cities, right? The ability to self-organize, right? Start credit unions with, $25, pulled together. Time and again, we see this having taken place. And I'll go back to the Ruch days. The ability to self-organize. This was at a time before independence, they didn't have telephone because only the privileged had telephones, right? The ways of communications were very, very limited. And yet there was this self-organization that took place across all of Ukraine. The vote for independence was over 93%. How did that happen? There was no government promoting it as such. It was self-organized. It was organically organized in different ways. And the Ruch, you've heard me say this over and over again, but I still think to this day, Ruch is probably the most strategic organization that I have been privileged to witness in Ukraine. And what I mean by that is that you had people like Ivan Drac and Mikhailo Hodin, and frankly, Maria Drac and Dmitro Pavlichko, who I consider one of the founding fathers of Ukraine's current civil society. And just a few things that happened. Maria Drac is never really talked about, but I think she's one of the heroes of that period. She was the key to organizing the women of Ruch, the women of Mothers of Chernobyl, the mothers of soldiers. Now, Soyuz Ukrainok had approached Maria Drac, and they wanted her to head Soyuz Ukrainok in Ukraine, which was an honor and she appreciated. But I remember her talking to me saying that she couldn't because she was working with all of these groups that were headquarters mostly in Kyiv, and they were all Russian speakers. And so she said, and so at that time, Soyuz Ukrainok had the requirement that you have to use Ukrainian. And so she said, you know, she couldn't leave that leadership position. And so Atana Pashko became the head of Soyuz Ukrainok. Why do I bring that up? Because the women of Ukraine played an incredible role that I don't think is appreciated to this day. And I mentioned like Chernobyl. We know Chernobyl was a major factor for the drive to independence. Equally important was the mothers of the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, who at that time were the ones that were used by the Kremlin as fodder for the war in Afghanistan. And so Ukrainian soldiers disappeared. They couldn't get any information. And so they mobilized. One of the things that they did was in October of 1990, which is before independence, Ruch had put out a declaration not to have the Victory Day report on parade on Khreshchatyk. And of course, their declaration didn't really mean much, but the women of Ruch went to the Soviet military representative, I should get his name, and said to him, before the tanks roll over the leaders of Ruch, they're gonna have to go over us. That year, the parade did not take place on Khreshchatyk. It took place on Shevchenko Boulevard. Now, this was late 90. They also passed legislation about conscription, the others. So the other thing that women were doing is they were going all over to villages in Ukraine to kind of get people ready for, I would say, independence. They gathered humanitarian assistance, and so they would go to villages and they would talk, and again, to bring people along. I recall Hodin in 92 going to Luhansk. They were already doing things in Eastern Ukraine to bring them into this, say, the family fold. I wanted to go with him, but I was not allowed. At that time, people could still. They brought children over from Eastern Ukraine to Western Ukraine to begin to experience, you know, Ukrainian Christmas traditions. So they laid down the groundwork for a lot of what we're seeing today. We can talk about the Helsinki group of this that took place. Certainly, the Millennium awakened the spiritual part of Ukraine. So all these things, I think, were a precursor to what took place with the Orange Revolution and certainly the Revolution in Dignity. But getting back to also this ability to self-organize, Refugees International went into Ukraine in 2015 or 16 at the start of the war. And their report was that they had never, ever seen in any other country the volunteerism and the spontaneous outpouring of support when the internally displaced people started to arrive off the trains into whatever city. Again, this ability to self-organize way ahead of the government. And we saw it with the volunteers in the military. And so as everybody says, or recognizes that every person in Ukraine is a part of this war and they're fighting it. Robert mentioned this former governor of Kherson, Andriy Puchilov. He was the one that was in prison for 72 days, held in solitary and beaten up. He's beaten up so badly that he's come to the States for some additional medical treatments. We were privileged to have a meeting with him. He spoke in Russian, he's learning Ukrainian. But he talked about, and he's the one that said, we would rather live under shelling than under occupation. And he also told us that a majority of the people of Kherson are supporting Ukraine. Why did Kherson fall so easily? It was because of collaborators within the community. And he knows who they are, and he actually tried to get rid of them, and that's part of the reason he was, I think, kidnapped and beaten so severely. Kyle also mentioned that we've now entered also a new opportunities. For a long time now, yes, Crimea, we were never going to recognize it, but it was this idea that it's never going to be able to be recaptured. I think that notion is gone. The reason I bring that up also, and that has to do partially with what we're seeing in Congress, unfortunate sort of dynamics. I kind of think about captive nations. How many years and decades? Everybody stood up, there wasn't a member of Congress that wasn't going to stand up and support some resolution or make a positive statement about captive nations. Was it so easy because they never thought there was going to be a time when there actually was going to be an opportunity to free these captive nations? I think so. But I think Ukraine's war, and when it wins, is going to be really able to break through that sort of what I would call politicians' easy chair mentality of being able to make proclamations without understanding that there's a commitment that needs to come with these various proclamations. So I think I'm probably over my time, if not. Okay. So I think that our job is to be really aware and understand the dynamics of what is organically happening in the growth of Ukraine's civil society, and to support it, but to support it intelligently. And I will just reminisce about one other thing. I made my first trip to Ukraine in 1990 for the Human Chain. For some reason, I felt that was going to be an important event. That's when I met the leaders of Ruch, and that's when I understood how strategic they were. They had negotiated with the KGB to allow, the rally and the flags, which were still illegal, and they made sure that the Human Chain was not broken. I recall coming out of the hotel in Kyiv, and there were buses from Ivano-Frankivsk, with flags, and they were there to make sure that there would not be, that the chain would be full, because they understood yet that the people of Kyiv were not necessarily yet ready to put out those flags. And we even heard that even in Western Ukraine, in villages and places, when the time was to put up the flag, somebody did one, and then somebody thought, oh gee, if they're brave enough to do it, I'll do it. And so it was a slow thing. But I learned a very important lesson that day. I happened to be on a bus after the end of the day of the commemorations. And there were these two babushki. And they saw people walking on the sidewalks with the flags. And they became emotionally unhinged they began to curse when they saw that flag, and I could not understand it at that moment. But later I understood. For them, it meant there's going to be a war, or there's going to be a famine. In other words, the flag represented, in some ways, terror, bad things to come. There was that fear that they had lived under, what they could say with the Holodomor, and subsequently, right? And that's what they were reacting to, that memory. I came away sort of feeling like, my parents, Ukraine wants to be independent, right? Captive nations. I didn't get that sense in Kyiv. They were not necessarily ready to articulate it. One more story too. After independence, you all know Katya Trumachenko-Yushchenko. Her great aunt, and this was like 92 or 3, and we're all euphoric because Ukraine's independent. Her great aunt was saving dry bread because she was getting ready for a famine. So the bravery of the people of Ukraine we're seeing, and the world is seeing it, and we are so blessed to have been privileged to see that all happen. Thank you.
There's always a danger with the McConnells that we'll start telling stories. We have a lot of them, as do many of the people, if not most of the people here and in the audience. Next week, I'm not going to make extensive introductions, one, because of time, and because our speaker, and because if you want to read a little details and so forth, they're in the program. But Lubomyr, Hajda, it's your microphone. Take it away.
Technology is not everything. Okay. Is this fine? Okay. Okay. Please let me know whether I'm too loud or too soft. I've been changing my mind what I'm going to say since from yesterday through this morning, even through Nadia's talk. So I want to apologize if this will be somewhat discombobulated, but I'm trying to kind of address issues as I realize their importance when I listen to other people. My original idea, and that I discussed with Walter, was to talk about the use of soft power and the condition of the current war in Ukraine, how that can be used, what are the means, what are the aims, who are some of the partners who can be brought into this effort. So this will not be a straightforward talk with a thesis, evidence and analysis and conclusion. It will be random thoughts, which I hope will serve some purpose in the end. I'll start with something pretty far from Ukraine and pretty distant from today, and that is France in the 1870s. You may know that in 1870 was the German-French War, or Prussian-French War, as we used to call it, as the result of which was that the French Empire of Napoleon III collapsed. The Germans occupied Paris, and the German Empire was proclaimed in no other place than the palace of French kings at Versailles. This led the French into a rather sad state of psychological depression, which was noted by many cultural figures. And among them was a young poet, Paul Déroulède, who became known from some of his wartime poetry. But by 1877, he had written a large dramatic piece whose purpose was to rekindle patriotism and faith in themselves and in their nation among the French by showing them a model, an example. I'm taking part of this from my own research, partly from that of my colleague who has worked very intensively with this, Ksenia Kibuzinska, who used to work at Harvard and is now at the University of Toronto, and wrote a PhD dissertation on Ukraine in French culture. The model that Paul Deroulede took to inspire the Frenchmen were Ukrainians, Ukrainian Cossacks. The title of the play was Letman, the Hetman. It takes place in the 1640s without the specific year marked with an X, but we can assume that it has some connection to the Khmelnytskina or his conception of the Khmelnytskina. And it's a combination of romance, battles, philosophizing, and so forth and so on. I will quote only one small extract from the first act. Two Polish noblemen are speaking, and one is saying to the other, you know, there are rumors afoot that the Cossacks are going to create an uprising in defense of their fatherland, the patrie. The other aristocrat says, surely you jest. How can you say that those brigands, those uncouth soldiers have a fatherland, a patrie? The hetman of the title is to the side, unseen by them, and he makes a remark aside and says, what matters a country's antiquity or grandeur when her sons pick up arms in defense of her freedom? A nation is born. What a fantastic sentiment. And this is attributed to Ukrainians to inspire the French. The play ends the hetman is killed. There is, you know, a lot of melodrama in between. And in the play, there is a character who is kind of a Greek chorus. She's called in French Marusha, which I imagine was how the French thought of Marussia. And she basically wanders in and out, philosophizing and commenting on events. And she has the last words in the play, looking at some of the deceased and some of the dead soldiers. And she says, these are the dead, but liberty lives. Liberté vive. This is one of many examples of Ukraine in European, West European, and even further afield, Western culture, which shows how familiar at that time, much more familiar than in the 20th century, the Europeans were about Ukraine and how much they connected Ukrainian history and Ukrainians with the notion of freedom. Very brief examples. In the 1890s, 1892, there was a premiere in Buenos Aires of an opera by Argentinian composer of Italian extraction to an Italian libretto by the name of Arturo Berruti, which in a recent, very recent history of Argentinian opera is called a watershed in Argentinian music, which divides our history between the past and the present. The title of the opera was Taras Bulba. So it was not Lysenko's Taras Bulba, it was Arturo Berruti's Taras Bulba, with wonderful tributes to Ukrainians, like the chorus of Zaporozhian Cossacks on their way to execution, Addio Patria Adorata, Ukrainia, adio, farewell, beloved motherland, Ukraine, farewell. Again, image of Ukraine as in land of freedom. 5 years later, 1897, think Buenos Aires, think Oslo, then known as Christiania in Norway, which was still in the crown of Sweden, about 5 years before Norwegian independence. An opera is put on, which in the Norwegian history of opera is called, this is our first spectacular grand opera, national opera. The title of that opera is Kozakyne, Cossacks, and it is based on Taras Bulba. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it came just as the Norwegians were about to gain their independence from Sweden. My point from this is that Ukrainians have a very rich, and I could go on and on, very rich background in European culture to fall back on, to make their case to belong to Europe, to have been known in Europe, to have been seen as freedom-loving and carriers of the torch of liberty. I think it would be wise if we had members of the Ukrainian community who have connection to the arts to help push performance of these works, revive them. Many of the Argentinians and Norwegians themselves don't know about these works, and we would help them rediscover their national heritage by pushing the Ukrainian elements of their own national cultures. So let me just very briefly, because I keep seeing all kinds of flashing signals about time, about some other examples of a soft, what I would call soft power for hard times. Of course, there is the history, Ukrainian history or elements of Ukrainian history. I don't want to say that we should not, we here and people within the Ukrainian community or academics devoted to the humanities or social sciences should not be aware, not pay attention to what is going on in the ground, on the ground in military terms and so forth and so on. But I think that that is very well covered already by the security experts, and one cannot say that Ukraine has been sort of missing from the news in that regard. But very often the expertise that these people have in security and military matters is not matched by their knowledge and understanding of history that is behind that. For some, this war of Russia and Ukraine may appear like, one-off thing. And of course, we know that there is a long history of Russian, very brutal, one could say savage, intervention in Ukraine. Two examples which should be brought to the attention of the journalists who covered the war and other analysts who discuss it. The sack of Kiev in 1169 by Andrei Bogolubsky from Suzdal. Suzdal, which was in the north, which, as Hrushevsky would say, was in its formative stages of creating the future Muscovite and Russian state. And it was quite clear that the prince, Bogolubsky, had a particularly vicious hatred of Kiev. The city was sacked, destroyed. The famous image of the Mother of God, which is now known as the Our Lady of Vladimir, from Vladimir in Russia, but which was in Vyshhorod near Kiev, was taken from there. The situation was so bad that a chronicler shortly later wrote, referring to the Mongol invasions of 1240, Suzdal destroyed Kiev so much in 1169 that the Mongols had nothing to destroy in 1240. That is an example of Russian intervention in Ukraine in an earlier period. A second one, I think that many of us do know that from at least Saturday school, but probably less well known is the sack of Baturin, the capital, the Cossack capital of Mazepa in 1708 during the Nava. The massacres that accompanied this sack have been largely suppressed in Russian and Soviet historiography. It would have undermined the thesis of the eternal friendship of peoples. It has been more recently after independence explored and written about, but it still has not entered sort of consciousness in a great way and is virtually unknown to the outside world. But without going into details, we know that between 10 and 15,000 people were massacred, including women, infants. The river ran with blood, as the chronicler says, and of course, Baturin itself was razed. Now, this brings me to something that one can see in American press coverage and the media coverage. Even the most favorably disposed toward Ukraine seem to go along with this notion that Ukraine and Russia have a shared history. And the friends of Ukraine will say, well, despite the fact that they have a shared history, you know, such and such, but the fact that they have a shared history seems to be accepted. Now, it's true that there are elements in the history of both that are shared. A lot of Ukrainians, myself, on occasion, perhaps others here, have spent a lot of time trying to disentangle this historical heritage and show, you know, that this is different, this is different. But what does it mean to be shared? The 19th century Southern plantation owners, slave owners, and the Black slaves working on those plantations had a shared history. Does that mean that they had the same experience, the same worldview, the same feelings about their situations? I rather doubt it. And Shevchenko in his Kobzar has some wonderful examples that can be used in trying to debunk to our American friends, and I mean friends, who should be more aware. And in his great poem, Son, well, he has three sons, but the one where he flies over St. Petersburg and makes comments about many things, but then his eyes alight on the statue of the so-called bronze horseman of Tsar Peter. And when he looks more closely, he says, ah, yes, and there's a sign saying, to the first from the second, meaning to Peter the first from Catherine the second. And then he comments who the first one was who crucified Ukraine and who the second one was who finally did in the orphan child. Or in Veliki Loch, where there are these three souls that are not allowed into paradise for their sins, one of whom wished Khmelnytsky a good journey as he was going to Pereyaslav to submit to the Tsar. A second one gave water to the horse of Peter to drink at the Battle of Poltava. And the third was an infant overlooking the Dnipro River held in her mother's arm as Catherine was making her famous tour to the south. And, you know, I love that phrase. Каже, чи я знала ще сповита, що тая цариця, лютий ворог України, голодна вовчиця. So the great Catherine for the Russians, the great Peter for Putin and the Russians are for Ukrainians in the person of Shevchenko are wolves, she-wolves, etc. It is, I think, no accident that among the photographs from Bucha, if you've seen it, is one of the head of Shevchenko with a bullet through it. I don't think that was just an accidental shooting. It was to destroy the image that Shevchenko created that millions of Ukrainians know. Again, for some reason, journalists and people in the media, the most critical of Putin and Russia, accept the moniker Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. And, you know, these monikers are monikers, but they still create impressions, as we know from Trump, who used to talk about lying Ted and, you know, little, you know, whatever, Rubio, I think, was little, and so forth and so on, you know, that it either demeans or it elevates people and creates, you know, subconsciously even an impression. I think, again, it would be at least a small favor to get the journalist to maybe drop the grade. I will end on the following, and that is the connection of all this to territorial integrity. I was glad to hear Crimea being mentioned earlier. Some of you know that I have a special interest and connection to things Crimean, and really before the invasion, Crimea had basically disappeared from the news, and during the first few months of the invasion, it was rarely mentioned. But now, again, it has come up as a possible recovery of Ukraine as Ukraine takes over. Ukrainians, including here, really have to make a stronger effort to put their footprint on Crimea. Last December, before the war, I talked to the then director of the Ukrainian Museum in New York, who has since retired, and one will have to start a new conversation with her successor, that about 8 or 10 months ago, the European court ruled that an exhibit of Scythian art and gold from Crimea, which was traveling in Europe, belongs to Ukraine. Russia was making claims on it, that it belongs to Ukraine. I'm not sure whether it was returned to Ukraine, whether it was still in Western Europe. I think the museum in New York, at least, maybe in Chicago as well, would do well to try to bring that exhibit here. You know, these are legitimate museums which already have a history of showing art on loan from Stockholm, the Royal Museum, and from other places. And can you imagine the kind of impact that showing Crimean treasures in the Ukrainian museum in New York, or making it a traveling museum perhaps in the country, would have? Not to mention the fact that the museum or other all museums in this country and in Canada should perhaps establish sections dealing with Crimean Tatar art. If Crimea is Ukrainian, the Crimean Tatars are a people, a nationality, a nation even, in Ukraine, who have demonstrated their patriotism, their devotion, and should we not present their art as their art, but also as part of the legacy of the Ukrainian state? So these are some, you know, ideas that I wanted to throw out about sort of soft power put to the use of you know, forwarding the Ukrainian cause in these, you know, difficult times, but difficult times give us opportunities to do important things. Thank you.
I want to thank Lubomyr for that presentation. I think you're right on point about now with all this interest in Ukraine that there are opportunities in culture, literature, and other ways, and hope that our artistic community takes advantage of it, and that maybe now the New York Times will revoke Durante's Pulitzer Prize. Perhaps maybe now they'll be more motivated to do that. But I just personally want to thank you for that wonderful presentation.
That was a presentation of soft power that was extremely powerful. None of that is in Putin's history books that keep getting quoted all the time. I could go on listening to this all afternoon and finding ways to use it. Among the museums, not a museum where I'd like those artifacts shown, would be the Rotunda on Capitol Hill in our capital, so our members could see Ukrainian art from Crimea. We've gone over our time, but not as much as we were encroached. So I don't know if Walter, you want any questions?
We can maybe one, we got 5 minutes and we did it.
Any questions? Good. When we break up, I'm going to ask a question.
I just want to make
Oh, yes.
one remark, and that is, we very often put forward demands to non-Ukrainians to do this and that for the other, on our behalf, or demands or requests. But sometimes perhaps we should also express our appreciation for what they have done. I don't know how many of you read the New York second paper, not the New York Times, but the New York Post. It's not sort of the elite paper, but let me show you. This is today's issue. And you will see that the banner has the American flag on one side and the Ukrainian flag on the other side. This has been on the front page of the New York Post since February 24th, every single day. And inside, they always devote a section called The Invasion to the events in Ukraine. And the New York Times itself has a banner inside, admittedly in somewhat smaller letters, War in Ukraine. If there were some way to, without, demeaning oneself, to thank, these outlets for their support, I think we should do that.
Thank you. Thank you.
That idea of soft power, there is something here, and I think the next panel, we both something about a year ago, and that dealt with different ways that Russians have portrayed World War II and so on, Ukrainian roles and so on. And then we went back in time, and one of the examples that I used in one of those things is Mazeppa. For the Russians, anathema. For us, we forget that Lord Byron thought he was the most inspiring. I mean, yes, there was the sexual stories were there too, and the other thing, but he was an inspiring figure. And that Mazeppa or Waterlick, the first constitution, modern times, before Montesquieu, we ourselves don't appreciate how much we actually impacted. And you reminded us that it was only in the 20th century that somehow what was once seen as the darlings, as the sort of freedom-loving Kuzake, the Turks reminding us that that's their word for freemen. We've never appreciated all of that. That it was all there, and that it got suppressed, and somehow we don't understand it. And I wanted to thank you, Nadia, because I know how much work you and Robert both did in terms of organizing from the ground up, all that self-help that's going. It was there, but you helped it along. So,
Well, I think Lubomyr is reminding us now is the time to make those, take those opportunities. Because everything Ukrainian is of interest, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes, now is the time, exactly right. And I wanted to thank all of you, and I'm sorry, actually, so at this point, I'm just hoping that he's safe. Do we know whether he's safe? No, we don't. No. And do you know whether Pani Hanya, because we're gonna have Pani Hanya at some point.
Oh, thank you. From you, it means a lot.
All right, we are not going to take a break at this point. We're going to take a break after the next session. For this session, and it's an important one, and I called it a special highlight session because we brought three individuals that have worked on this a long time, and that's something we know as Russian DEZINFORM. And so I'm going to be asking Janusz Bugajski, and I'm going to be asking Dr. Lubomyr Luciuk and Dr. Volodymyr Vyatrovych to come to the focus, to the dais.
Do you have that written down?
No.
And the subject, my suspicion is that as fascinating as all the other panels have been, this one, I would keep my ears and eyes open because this one happens to deal with what we had talked about very early on, and that's the memory wars. These are three that have engaged in the memory wars with the Russians for a long, long time. So Janusz, you're the memory warrior of all time. So I give it over to you.
Memory hasn't gone yet.
Yeah, no, it hasn't.
It gets better as I get older. Just give me a second.
No, Janusz, I was going to,
Is Michael joining us?
yeah.
No, he's in the later. He's later.
He's later,
Just
yeah.
us. Just us.
Okay, so it's all yours, Janusz.
Okay, great. Thanks, Walter. Thanks for organizing these sessions. Your commitment to Ukraine, I always said, is an inspiration to all of us, not just for Ukrainians, but also Poles like me. It's anyway, this is a special highlight focus session on Ukrainian national identity. And our panel's topic is examining ways to blunt distortions of Ukrainian national identity. In other words, how to counter distorted images of Ukraine and Ukrainians, but also to assert the facts about Ukrainian history, tradition, longevity, and identity. And I want to make three brief points before engaging our two panelists. First point. Since the beginning of the expansion of Muscovy, neighboring principalities and city-states have been swallowed, digested, and Russified, and the process continues to this day. Moscow's rulers were particularly successful in assimilating neighboring Slavic speakers and Christian Orthodox believers. However, in the case of Ukraine, the process was blocked, partially by the existence of the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth, and primarily by the independent traditions of Ukrainians, particularly the Cossack and peasant communities. My first point, therefore, is that Ukrainians and their allies must better educate the West, including journalists, but not only, policymakers, about Ukraine's history of resisting Muscovite colonialism and imperialism, and better inform those journalists and pundits on how Russia has persistently tried to eradicate their distinct national identity. Historical literacy is needed just as much as media literacy. So that's my first point. My second point, which sort of follows on from the first, is that Muscovite rulers, regardless of their ideological beliefs, engage in periodic genocide against Ukrainians, particularly when their efforts at assimilation, Russification, and mass deportation prove inadequate. The Holodomor was the most extensive example in the 20th century, but there were many other campaigns to eliminate the Ukrainian intelligentsia, the clergy, and its political class. Putin is simply applying and repeating this policy. And it is important for Westerners to understand that Putin himself is not the cause of the problem. He is the result of the problem. The fundamental problem for Ukraine and its neighbors is the existence of an imperial Russian state that appropriates the history and territory of its neighbors and destroys their language, culture, and values of captured nations, especially Ukrainians, I would say. So unless this state is fully neutralized or fractured, it will generate new wars and new genocides in the future. We now have a unique opportunity to make sure that Europe's last empire, last colonial empire, is terminated through defeat in battle and an internal implosion of the state. Third point, particularly regarding disinformation. Moscow is trying every trick, often very primitive, in its disinformation manual to distort the image of Ukrainians, operating on the Goebbels principle that if you repeat a lie often enough, increasing numbers of people will repeat it themselves and may even believe it. For instance, if you listen to a lot of Russian TV disinformation, the Ukrainian army is a cannibalistic gang of gay Nazi pedophiles who are really NATO special forces in disguise because they are defeating the Russian military. I mean, this demonstrates both desperation, but also I would say deep fear among the Russian elite that the people that they have been denigrating as inferior bumpkins, country bumpkins for so many generations, are actually better warriors with a stronger sense of national identity and cultural tradition than many of those who call themselves Russian. Moscow's elites, I would say, are fearful that with Russia's defeat on the battlefields, Ukraine will strengthen its statehood, reclaim its history, all the way back to Kiev and the Rus. It is worth pointing out, I don't know what preceded, the media panel, yes, just to sort of follow up on that. I'm not sure how much history was preceded here, but it's worth pointing out that even the ethnonym Rus was appropriated by Muscovy to claim the territory of its neighbors that they conquered. So the process of Ukraine's triumph will be bolstered as Westerners become better informed that the Russian Federation is a failed state and that it camouflages its failure with aggression against its neighbors. As that aggression falters, then the failed state itself will begin to internalize its aggression, which happens to be the subject of my new book from Jamestown Foundation. It's called Failed State, A Guide to Russia's Rupture. In fact, I just gave a lecture on the book to the American Academy in Kiev by Zoom just a couple of hours ago. A friend of mine is running the program there. So in any case, it's available from Jamestown PDF or in hard copy as well. So let me stop there and briefly introduce my two panelists. You have the more detailed bios. Let me just very briefly introduce them one after the other. Lubomyr Luciuk is Professor of Political Geography at the Royal Military College of Canada, a Fellow of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Toronto, and the author of numerous publications dealing with the political history of the Canadian-Ukrainian community, as well as contemporary Ukraine. So start with Lubo, but let me also introduce Volodymyr. Volodymyr Vyatrovych is a member of the Verkhovna Rada. Prior to his parliamentary career, he served as the head of the Ukrainian Institute of National Remembrance. He also served prior to that as the director of the Security Service of Ukraine Archives, where he helped open up the KGB archives to the public. So let me start with Lubo.
Slide. Get the next slide on. Good, thank you. Before I begin my formal presentation, I'd just like to remind you that when Vladimir Putin, the KGB man in the Kremlin, announced his special military operation, he very clearly stated that one of the purposes of this military operation was to eliminate the Banderiuchi from Ukraine. He subsequently changed it to Nazis and nationalists and so on. But if you go back to the 24th of February, it was the Banderivci that he wanted to get rid of. Now, as we think about disinformation, what I like to do is talk about the long duration of Soviet and now Russian Federation disinformation that's been directed particularly against the Ukrainian diaspora, against Ukrainians in the United States, against Ukrainians in Canada, and throughout what I would call the free world. When I started to think about this, I was reminded of this wonderful quotation from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. We know they are lying. They know they are lying. They know we know they are lying. We know they know we know they are lying, but they are still lying. I think that kind of almost sums up everything you need to know. Oh, and by the way, that Walter Duranty was mentioned. This is my favorite photograph of Walter Duranty laughing at us. Back in the late 1970s, stories began to appear throughout the North American press about thousands of Nazi war criminals hiding in the United States and Canada. Most famously, of course, in the United States, John Demjanjuk, whom you all remember. In Canada, it came a little bit later. It started in the early 1980s, just as I was completing my doctorate at the University of Alberta before I moved to Toronto, where I became a fellow of the Chair of Ukrainian Studies. And so on April 8th, 1985, I found myself drawn into the work of a group that came to be known as the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, a group that was headed by a mildly eccentric lawyer by the name of John Grigorovich, who we'll see in a second. Andrei, sorry. Next slide. He's listening to music. John Grigorovich, who was the chairman of this group. And John had a view. He believed that this entire campaign about thousands of Nazis hiding in North America was actually part of a Soviet campaign to, in some way, defame the diaspora, to undermine the work of the diaspora. Now, we had no proof of that. We had no proof that, in fact, his hunch was true. And eventually, in the 1980s, in fact, on the 9th of February, 1985, the government of Canada followed the American model and established a special commission of inquiry on war criminals headed by the late Mr. Justice Jules Chen, a judge from the Quebec court. This commission continued its work for about 2.5 years and eventually in March of 1987 released a report. Now, I'll tell you the results of the report, and all of this, by the way, is in this book, Operation Payback. Some of you have it, some of you would like to get it, it's outside. Our position was, when this campaign began, that any war criminal found in Canada or in North America, regardless of who they are by ethnicity or faith group, what war they may have committed an atrocity during and so on, anyone found of committing any kind of crime of that sort should be brought to trial in a Canadian criminal court of law or an American criminal court. And so when we took that rather principled position, we felt fairly strong in our ability to resist calls for the American model, which was denaturalize and deport. So simply put, in America, if someone accused you of being a war criminal and could say, when you came to to the United States as a displaced person, as a DP in 1949 or 50 or 51, if you didn't tell us that you were a member of the Divizia Halachina or an OUN or UPA, then we will say you lied to get your citizenship, and therefore we can take your American citizenship away, denaturalize you, and deport you. In Canada, it was a very different position. We argued, as I say, that the government, if it had a case against someone, should make that case in a criminal court of law where the rules of evidence are very stringent. You are innocent until proven guilty. We also disputed, and this was a very contentious period, a very unpleasant period, frankly, in my life, because of the tensions that immediately emerged between two very particularly powerful diasporas, the Jewish diaspora and the Ukrainian, and to a lesser degree, Baltic diasporas. We had this tension over what happened on Ukrainian lands or in Eastern Europe or generally during the Second World War. So there were many accusations made in the public media almost on a daily basis about how the Ukrainian community was hiding Nazis in its midst. We disputed that. Eventually, although not particularly surprisingly, Mr. Justice Deschênes released a report, it came out in March of 1987, in which he pilloried those who had claimed that there were thousands of Nazis in North America or in Canada in particular. In fact, he scolded them publicly for quote unquote grossly exaggerating the numbers. And he wrote, between 1971 and 1986, public statements by outside interveners concerning alleged war criminals have spread increasingly large and grossly exaggerated figures as to their estimated number. In fact, he said the numbers have been exaggerated by over 400%. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Deschênes died in 2000, so he never learned what Mr. Grigorovich had suspected, that this was all, in fact, a Soviet disinformation campaign. We now have a document called Operation Payback or Operation Retribution, which was generated in 1985 by the Soviet KGB, by the Soviet Ukrainian KGB, in cooperation with the federal KGB, that says their intention was to deliberately provoke tension and discord between the Jewish and Ukrainian diasporas. And they brag in this document about how the pressure they applied through the public media, newspapers, films, and so on, forced the government of the United States to create the Office of Special Investigations. And then they go on to say, wow, that was so successful, we're going to do that in Canada. And we did. And guess what? We have the Deschênes Commission. So black and white, the Soviet KGB bragging about the success of Operation Payback. Now, I have to tell you, we had these feelings that maybe this was a Soviet disinformation campaign. We were also warned by the dissidents. We've had some mention earlier today about the dissidents, one of whom I'm sure many of you will remember was named Volodymyr Moroz, very prominent in his time. And I remember going to a lecture in Toronto, it was in the early 1980s, and Volodymyr Moroz came to Toronto and gave a talk in which he said that Moscow was deliberately trying to paralyze, that was the word he used, the Ukrainian community in North America by spreading these pernicious stories about how Ukrainians had collaborated with the Nazis during the Second World War. The Soviets, Moroz insisted, were hoping to pit the Jewish and Ukrainian communities against each other. Now, I have to say, I don't think most of us paid much attention. I don't think we got the message that Moroz gave us. We didn't heed the warning of this modern day Cassandra. Well, skipping a bit forward, I want to say something about this whole question of, were there Nazis in North America? Are there Nazis still to this day? And those of you who are my American colleagues will know that only just a few weeks ago in Newsweek magazine, there was a large article by Alan Dershowitz that talks about Khmelnytsky, the mass murderer who has a monument in Kyiv, literally using these terms, Khmelnytsky. In 2022, we're still talking about Khmelnytsky. And then, of course, Bandera, UNUPA, and so on. So let's talk about the question of whether there are still Nazis around. So my answer is simply going to be this: no. How do I know that? Well, let's do the math. If you were an 18-year-old German in 1933 and you joined the Nazi party when Hitler came to power, today you would be 106, or to put it another way, dead. Okay. If you were 18 and you joined the SS, let's say, in 1939 when the war began, at least the war that we call the Second World War, today you'd be 101 or 100. Possibly still a few people alive, and not too far back, a few months ago, the German government actually brought a camp guard aged 100, completely senile, to court and charged him with war crimes. But there are very few of these people left. Thankfully, on the flip side of the coin, despite the imperial pretensions of the KGB men in the Kremlin, there are no Chekists around. Putin's grandfather was a loyal servant of Stalin in the Cheka. There are very few NKVD men of his father's generation left. By the way, this means that Putin has 2 generations of family serving Stalin. But if you do the math and you take a Russian who was, say, 18 years old and at the start of the Great Patriotic War in 1941, well, this person would now be yeah, perhaps about 94, 95 years old. And so it's very possible that there are still individuals who participated in some crimes against humanity during the Second World War alive and with us. And of course, we all know that the Soviet Union did not implode until 1991, so the KGB was around many more years after that. So it's very likely that there are people in the KGB or FSB now who were involved in these kinds of crimes. Why do I mention this? Well, first of all, the whole question of are there Nazis in North America, I think, is now moot. The question of whether there are any Soviet war criminals or collaborators or enablers or people who were in the NKVD or KGB here is, I think, still open to discussion. And in fact, in Canada, we found, wait for it, thousands, no, hundreds, no, 5. We found 5 individuals who wrote books in English, published in Canada, or gave interviews to the media in which they boasted about being in the NKVD, in the KGB, SMERSH. One of them, a woman from Montreal, was in SMERSH, and her role as a physician, forget the Hippocratic oath here for a moment, was to jump into burial pits and make sure that all the people being executed were truly dead. So her role basically was to go around as a doctor and say, he's still alive, come back and shoot him again. And she was in Montreal, Canada, giving interviews. Interestingly enough, none of those people were ever brought under any kind of official scrutiny in Canada or in the United States by the OSI. Now, again, we all know that people who suffered under Nazi tyranny during the Holocaust can take some comfort in the fact that most of the major Nazi war criminals were brought to justice, tried and punished. And even the lesser villains were either caught or are now dead, even as their ideology and their deeds have been condemned everywhere, and rightfully so, by men and women of goodwill. But at the same time, we also know that regrettably, no similar concerted effort has ever been made to identify or much less punish Stalin's henchmen or his successors, not in the Soviet Union, in the Soviet period, and not even in any of the successor states, not even in post-1991 Ukraine was there any effort made to bring these people to justice. So some of the great villains of all time, think of Kaganovich, think of Molotov, you all know these names, think of Berman, who was the head of the Gulag. All of these people either died in their beds at rest, at peace, or in Berman's case, was shot, good for him, but then rehabilitated by Khrushchev. So the fact is, and this is an unpalatable fact, but it's true, some fiends got away with it. No matter how vicious they were, they got away with it. Even Stalin remains entombed in the Kremlin wall. And I have been there twice, although I'm now persona non grata by the Russian Federation, so I guess I'll never get back to see the Kremlin again. But there is a space for Stalin, and every day when I was there, red roses were put at Stalin's grave. So, what happened with the Nazis in North America? Well, quite predictably, old men and old women eventually start dying off. Proponents of the "there are Nazis amongst us" story began shifting gears. In Canada, they went away from the made in Canada criminal law solution to actually adopting the American OSI model of denaturalize and deport. But even when they sort of downgraded our judicial system to make it easier to identify and prosecute so-called Nazi war criminals, they couldn't make a single case stick. It's quite remarkable. In Canada, they couldn't make a criminal case stick. They couldn't make a civil proceeding stick. It wasn't simply possible given the evidence base they had. Now, the sad part about it, of course, is while this was going on, families were disrupted, people were brought before public tribunals, defamed, communities were riled, tensions were stoked. And it was all very selective. Again, I want to emphasize this, in Canada, not a single individual who publicly boasted about being in the NKVD, KGB, or SMERSH was ever investigated, not one. It was a very selective, I would say, far from just system. So proponents of this, let's get the Nazis out of Canada or the United States, let's bring them to trial, let's deport them, whatever you want, basically lost. The evidence to secure convictions was simply not there. Meanwhile, those who found themselves in front of such tribunals, of course, suffered great personal stress. With the benefit of hindsight, looking back at it now from 2022, we can see that these so-called Nazi hunters, and you've heard their names here in Canada and the United States, were rather like the inquisitors that we hear of from ancient times. They were triggered really by a self-serving imperative. If you were a Nazi hunter or a witch hunter, you had to find witches. Otherwise, you'd be out of a job. If you can't find Nazis or claim you found Nazis, you'll be out of a job. So these so-called self-titled, often Nazi hunters, either had to uncover or invent Nazis, the modern equivalent of heretics and other mythical monsters, or find themselves exposed as having no real purpose. So they kept at it, and they've kept at it for many years since. Eventually, of course, old men and old women die off. It becomes obvious that there are no Nazis left. And so they shifted gears again. Rather than going back to the courts, they instead ramped up what was referred to earlier in the day as a memory war, one directed more broadly against Ukrainian nationalism. And that too provoked ill-tempered exchanges between particularly the Jewish and Ukrainian diasporas, arguing about who did what to whom, when and why during and around the time of the Second World War. And in that same period of time, which we're now taking us into the late 1990s and into the 2000s, you began seeing a different kind of campaign, one which was organized to convince the wider North American public that not only had Nazis once been hiding here, oh, it's unfortunate our judicial systems weren't able to get rid of them, we failed there. But what's worse, not only did these Nazis get here and get away with it, that's the way the lingo goes, but they grew up a new generation of children who have built monuments and put up memorials and statues and plaques honoring these Nazi collaborators and war criminals. So there's this wide campaign to sort of now say, well, let's get rid of the Nazi monuments. And that was accompanied, as you'll see in a few moments, by various acts of criminal vandalism directed against memorials honoring veterans of OUN or OPA or the Galicia Division. We now know clearly who was behind it. It was, in Canada, the embassy of the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation's embassy in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, had an individual by the name of Kalinin, and it was confirmed that he was in fact provoking some of these attacks against Ukrainian memorials to divizia and so on. And so eventually, when he went a little too far and attacked our Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, Chrystia Freeland, calling her grandfather a Nazi, and therefore her foreign policy towards Russia is improper because she's a Nazi descendant, as if, you know, her lineage somehow has an impact on it, but that's what he was trying to provoke. He was actually described as a persona non grata and expelled from Canada. But very clearly, there were these many multiple attempts at subversive interventions into North American society, both in Canada and the United States. And this echoed earlier historical attempts to sully the reputations of many of Ukraine's historic leaders, like Simon Petlura or Shukhevich or Bandera. All of their graves, all of their markers have been repeatedly vandalized. Sadly, instead of condemning this hooliganism, there were some Jewish Ukrainian organizations, Jewish Canadian organizations that would have, you know, screamed if this had been happening to their community centers or cemeteries and so on, instead stayed quiet and have said nothing. So despite the fact that a Ukrainian Orthodox priest's house was set on fire in Victoria, British Columbia just a few weeks ago, despite the fact that cemeteries have been defaced in Oakville and in Edmonton, despite the fact that a memorial to Shukhevich was spray painted just a few months ago in Edmonton, despite all of that, future bakery businesses, community centers, no condemnation has come from the public domain, from government, or from the ethnic organizations you might think would be particularly keen about condemning that. And sadly, that tells me something about the brilliance the success of the KGB architects who were behind Operation Payback. They were able to stoke a certain level of Ukrainophobia. They were able to play off stereotypes on both sides. They were abetted by a gaggle of fellow travelers in the West. They were able to pretend and promote the notion that Nazis, fascists, collaborators, war criminals, and their children who took on that ideology were infused throughout North America, and that was why justice was delayed or never done. Now, I understand Mr. Putin perfectly well. He's a Soviet man, and so he continues to be an advocate of what's been referred to as the ahistorical claim that Russians and Ukrainians are all of one blood and so on, and that, you know, Ukrainians shouldn't worry about Russia because we're just Malorus, all that stuff. He's a Soviet man, and I'm a not Soviet man. We're the same age, roughly. So I understand the different perspectives that we both take. But that ahistorical notion that Ukrainians and Russians are one has been perpetuated for decades. We've all referred to it obliquely, at least today. We now know, of course, and we've always said it, but I think most of our neighbors now know that Ukrainians never were, aren't now, and never will be Russians. They're completely different nations. It's taken a war, Ukraine's war of national liberation, to, I think, convince most of our neighbors of what's truly happening. This is, as some of you have referred to, not just a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a genocidal war against Ukraine and Ukrainians and against us in the diaspora. It has been a campaign of disinformation that has gone on from the 1970s and probably even earlier. It's been orchestrated and stoked by the Soviet Union and by the Russian Federation. We'll just take a look at a few pictures just to give you some images of this. So these are the kinds of leaflets that were distributed by the Soviets. Some of you remember some of these. One of the most famous one was We Accuse. This was reissued in multiple copies. These are just a sample of what they were distributing in English and sending it out around North America. We countered, of course. Next. One of the things that we can do in Canada that you can't do in the United States is to actually use what they call a franking privilege. You can write a letter or send a postcard to any member of our parliament for free, simply by putting OHMS on Her Majesty's service in the upper right-hand corner. So we began generating the cards. This was the very first card we ever did. And this was about the use of Soviet evidence before the DEZINFORM Commission. Thousands of these kinds of cards were sent to members of parliament and the prime minister and so on, attempting to, tell our side of the story. We even went to the extent of taking out a full-page ad in the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's national newspaper of record. We also joined with other East European communities to try to combat the disinformation. This was the first time the Canadian Ukrainian community did this. This was the equivalent of, say, the American Ukrainian community taking out a full page in the New York Times or the Washington Post, something like that. It was a big deal for us, and it really got a big amount of pushback from the other side of the debate, who accused us of trying to sort of hide Nazis. Next. We also published our own books. One of the ones that I was particularly pleased about was the one on the left, which you can read for free on the website of the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Into Auschwitz for Ukraine, the memoir of a Ukrainian nationalist, a Bondarevich, and a member of UPA, who was caught by the Nazis and spent many of the war years in not only Auschwitz, 154922 is his tattoo number, but also in Ebensee and several other camps. He was essentially dead at the end of the war on May 8th, when his friends came down from another camp and pulled him off a pile of bodies. He was twitching. So he literally came back to life, as he tells in the story, on Ukrainian Easter. So he said, I was reborn. Other booklets, On the Record, Soviet Evidence in North American Courts, that was written by a Lithuanian American, Paul Zimbakis. Not Worthy, Trial and Error, written by Nikolai Tolstoy, the descendant of Tolstoy. So we had some cooperation with patriotic Russians at the time, although he's since changed his mind about Ukraine. This was the actual DEZINFORM Commission report as it looked. In the book, you'll find quite a lot of information. I've excerpted sections from the Deschênes Commission about the divizia. For example, Deschênes said, you cannot indict the Ukrainian division as a group. They are not guilty of war crimes. This was examined in 1945, in 1950, and here I've done it again, and there's nothing here. And in fact, we also included a document that wasn't in the Deschênes Commission report, where Stalin and Churchill are sitting around discussing the divizia. And Stalin says, I don't care. And it's in a British government document. No one had seen it before we dug it up. Next. So who were the targets? The targets, there's Mr. Deschênes. There are some of the comments he made about the divizia. Who were the targets? The targets were those Canadian Ukrainian men and women who volunteered to serve overseas in the Second World War. That's Mr. Bogdan Panchuk, Flight Lieutenant Panchuk, in the uniform of the Royal Canadian Air Force, visiting the members of the divizia in Rimini in Northeast Italy. Panchuk and several others served in the war with distinction. So they fought for Canada, they proved their loyalty, and then during and just at the end of the war, and for several years after that, they lobbied to allow for the resettlement of Ukrainian DPs and political refugees throughout the free world, to Canada, the United States, and so on. Ukrainian Americans were also involved. Next. Targets were, of course, not just the Canadian Ukrainians who helped save these Nazis, so-called, but also the Nazis themselves, and I put that in quotation marks. This is an example of the political refugees having the DP. Some of you may know people who were in these camps. This is in Freimann Kaserne, outside of Freimann Kaserne in Munich, a protest in April of 1949. What I particularly like about this photograph is that it came to me from a friend in Winnipeg whose father passed and had a small little box of photographs. And this photograph he sent to me when I was looking for a cover for one of my books. And a moment I pulled it out of the envelope, I said, this has to be the photograph. Why did I want this one? Well, of course, it shows political activism. They're protesting communist terror. They're protesting the executions and so on. But walking in this parade, here is my father, who had no idea that his picture was taken that day and no idea that that photograph existed until I put it on the cover of my book. Next. Again, a typical example, the kind of postcards we generated in Canada when we had to deal with the D&D issue, denaturalize and deport. You lied about who you were when you got American citizenship or Canadian citizenship. We will now strip you of your right to be a citizen. Now, again, this was applied selectively. And again, and here's where I think I want to emphasize something about the Holodomor. Who were the survivors of the Holodomor? People from Velika Ukraina. Most of the DPs were from Western Ukraine. But there were refugees from Velika Ukraina, from Soviet Ukraine. They were supposed to be sent back to the Soviet Union under the terms of the Yalta Agreement. If you were a Soviet citizen, you had no choice. They would send you back. And there were screening commissions run by the Americans, by the Canadians, by the British, and the Soviets that interviewed people in the refugee camps and said, who are you? Where are you from? Halichane, or Western Ukrainians, helped coach Eastern Ukrainians into stories of village life so that they could pretend that they were from Western Ukraine and not as Soviet citizens be deported. And yet millions were. It's an allied war crime. It was described that way at the time. Some Ukrainians from Eastern Ukraine, Velika Ukraina, survived. We know that because you know some of them. My own godmother was one of them. She lied to get into Canada. Oh, so you lied to get into Canada, you got your citizenship through false pretenses, we can now denaturalize and deport you. One of the reasons so many people didn't talk about the Holodomor was because if they admitted they were survivors of the Holodomor, they would have admitted to American or Canadian authorities that they'd lied to get into Canada or the United States. They were Eastern Ukrainians who lied to live. Again, I talked about books that were written by veterans of the NKVD, KGB. There are two of them on the left. I got the one on the bottom by Joseph Rivash at my local Hadassah Bazaar in Kingston at the synagogue. The other one I bought. These two individuals were people who willingly, consciously served the Soviet state, and who in their books, written in English, again, and published in Canada and Montreal, admit that they killed people, including Ukrainian nationalists. We organized the campaign, as you can see on the right-hand side, no means no, no KGB in Canada. We actually had one KGB officer who was identified, and the authorities said, you can't stay. So he claimed that he was a refugee. He got a hearing. He failed. They said, you're not a refugee, you'll have to leave, sir. And then he claimed sanctuary in a Vancouver church basement. Now, I know we've all enjoyed Disney, and we really all probably remember the Hunchback of Notre Dame cartoon, and she seeks sanctuary in the church, and the king's men can't touch her. Well, that's not really a legal concept. It doesn't exist. But because this man was clever enough to claim sanctuary, and there were some well-intentioned people who said, yes, we'll shelter you, he spent almost 2 years living in a church basement in Canada while we campaigned to have him removed. This is ridiculous. But the authorities wouldn't go into a church to remove a KGB man. There you go. We also did the flip side. You know, some of this is negative, challenging disinformation, questioning Soviet sources, questioning the Russian Federation operatives, and so on. We also honored those Canadian men and women of Ukrainian origin and Ukrainian Americans who helped in England and on the continent during the war to save the DPs and the victims of the Holodomor and victims of the war and so on. This is the memorial window that we unveiled at St. James Church in Paddington. It's an Anglican church. It was the headquarters of the Ukrainian Canadian Servicemen's Association and of the Central Ukrainian Relief Bureau during the latter years of the war and for almost a decade after. So in this church, where many of them went to pray, where Panchuk and his wife, who you saw, were actually married on the 75th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, we actually unveiled that stained glass window with a trezub and a sonus. People go, how could you even think ahead that the sunflower would be so important now? Dumb luck. It wasn't like we thought it through, but that's what it is. So if you're ever in England and you're in Notting Hill Gate, which used to be kind of rundown part of London, but is now very, very trendy, go into St. James Church and you'll see a trezub. You'll see the recollection of the good work these men and women did. Some examples of the vandalism that's occurring in Canada. There's the Jurkiw monument on the right, actual Nazi. That was spray painted in August of 2021. That's the famous Future Bakery in Toronto. You can tell it's a Russian because he can't spell Ukraine. Ukraine, fuck Ukraine. I apologize for the language. What's interesting about the monument on the right is after some of these vandalism things had occurred, we put up security cameras at the Ukrainian Zoom Hall in Edmonton. And we have wonderful footage of this man coming. He's about my height. He's wearing a blue jean shirt or something and blue jean pants, and he's got a baklava, he's hiding his face, and he comes in and does a spray paint. Okay, can't prove anything. Except that same genius, obviously not very bright, came back the next morning early with his camera gear, same clothes, minus the mask, to take pictures so he could post on his blog how righteous citizens had defaced a Nazi statue. He was charged last week. Got him. So when you hear stories of, outraged citizens do this or do that, maybe it's the people who have most to gain, who benefits. In this case, he tried to. This is the actual document. This is just, it's in the book, both in its original version and in English translation. So you can see it's on KGB letterhead. But I just want to, again, before I conclude, underscore some of these points. So if you read it, the lines in red I think are important. In consultation with the KGB of the Soviet Union, they did what? They compelled the American government to create the Office of Special Investigations of the Department of Justice in order to identify and pursue Nazi war criminals and to shape US public opinion advantageous to us. They knew exactly what they were doing. And then, considering how positive this had been from their point of view, they also took measures aimed at unfolding a similar campaign in Canada. right? And then that forced the government of Canada to establish in February of this year a commission headed by the lawyer Deschamps. This is Chorna-Nabila. And if you look at the rest of the document, you'll see how they talk about planting things in the American newspapers, how they plant things in the Jewish press and so on to get anger, to stir up discord. Okay, let me conclude. There are far more sublime souls than mine in this room. And some of you might say, well, forgive them for they know not what they do. But I find that when I reflect on all of this, what was done to our diaspora here in the United States or in Canada or elsewhere around the free world was done quite deliberately. And that the KGB architects of this Operation Payback were brilliant. So let's first of all give the devil his due. They not only mined pre-existing ethnic prejudices and stereotypes, but they re-engineered those into a much more virulent strain. And then they broadcast these tropes comprehensively. And they spread what I will call a pandemic of venomous half-truths and prejudice that continues to infect. How do we deal with that? Well, for such an illness, one that was so laboriously manufactured, I'm afraid there is no cure, save perhaps for the passage of time. I certainly pray that the truth will someday set our peoples free. But frankly, I have no hope of this occurring in whatever time I have left on this earth, nor indeed before several more generations have come and wandered and gone. The poison, frankly, of Operation Payback was simply planted far too deeply. So to conclude with embattled Ukraine that we've been talking about, there's the KGB man in the Kremlin, there's Ukraine's Moses, a hero, President Zelensky, there's a victim of Bucha, and there's a 14th century icon that bears a striking resemblance to some modern political leader. And that's a real icon, believe it or not. I have no idea how they knew. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luca. Let's go straight on to Volodymyr.
I would speak how Russia uses history in its war against Ukraine. Russia's war against Ukraine, which began in 2014, is called a hybrid war, as it emphasizes that military operations are not its only or even its main tool of conduct. Because this confrontation is war for identity. History in this confrontation is one of the areas of this collision. And for the Russian leadership, it is also an important instrument of war. After all, common ideas about the past are one of the foundation of national identity. This is war for identity, so it is fought not only for territory, but for the souls of people, their worldviews and values. Control over the former is seen as a bridgehead for influencing the latter. Such war means that Putin will not stop after seizing of part of Ukrainian territory. He needs all of Ukraine because he needs all Ukrainians. It is Ukrainians, after appropriate ideological processing, who will become the builders of the Russian world, the embodiment of Russian new imperial ideology. Last summer, the Russian president published an article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians on the Kremlin's official website. Its essence is clear from the name alone. It was far from the first, although very extensive justification of the key thesis of Russian propaganda that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. Another appeal to this vision of the past was voiced by Vladimir Putin in his speech from 21 February, 3 days before the start of full-scale invasion of his troops into Ukraine. Why is there so much history in the speeches and articles of head of Russian Federation? Of course, this is in order to justify the aggression by appealing to the past. However, history, more precisely quasi-historical myths, perform other important functions for the Kremlin that are directly related to the war in Ukraine, in particular as a tool for mobilizing Russians in confronting Ukrainians. Second, as a means of disorientation and division of Ukrainian society, and use it to discredit Ukraine and Ukrainians throughout the world. The main message that Kremlin is trying to convey to Ukrainians, Russians, and the world is that there is no separate Ukrainian nation. It is ancient and based on the Russian imperial myth. If Ukrainians and Russians are one people, then there is no sense in existence of separate Ukrainian states. It is just geopolitical mistake that should be correct. If we were one people, then there is no occupation of Crimea, of other Ukrainian territories. Then the current war between Ukrainians who defend freedom and Russians who are trying to enslave them is civil war because it is fought between representatives of the same people. The following are key historical plots used to justify this thesis. This is history of Rus, history of colonization of south and east of Ukraine by Russian Empire, and of course the Second World War presented as Great Patriotic War. The monopolization of history of Rus, Russia is the sole heir to Rus, is not only about making Kremlin own history more ancient. This is one of the key justifications for Russian imperial encroachment on Ukrainian territory, the core of Russian imperial myths about Third Rome. The threat of an imaginary connection from Rome and Constantinople will not lead to Moscow without Kiev. This is how the myth loses its basis of existence. One of the examples of encroachment on Rus heritage in modern Russian historical politics is the opening of monument of Volodymyr the Great in Moscow in November 2016. Vladimir Putin said this at the time. The new monument is a tribute for our distinguished ancestors, especially to this revered saint, statesman, and warrior, the spiritual founder of Russian state. Stories about the imperial colonization of these lands at the end of 18th century served as justification for Russia's current encroachments on the south and east of Ukraine. Modern Kremlin propaganda claims that civilization appeared in this area only after the arrival of the Russians. Their history as part of Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ukrainian hetmanship, or Crimean Khanate is simply omitted. This is facilitated by the fact that the official founding dates of settlements in the south of Ukraine are still tied to imperial decrees of the 18th century. This, for example, the history of Odessa is shortened by more than 2 times, and thus the city fits into Russian historian narrative. Crim is ours, Crim nash, because it became so at the end of 18th century, but before that it was no one's. There was a Novorossiya in the south of Ukraine, and it should therefore appear again. Putin is only restoring historical justice. Another important message of Kremlin propaganda is connected with the same imperial myth. It was Russia that was and is the bearer of education, culture, and science on Ukrainian territory. Ukrainians had known of this because they were incapable of creating their own science and culture. These imperial plots fulfill all 3 of above mentioned tasks of Russian historical propaganda. Mobilizing their own population, we are returning our own, correcting the mistakes of the past because Khrushchev gifted Crimea to Ukraine. This myth disorienting Ukraine, you were never there, discrediting Ukraine efforts in the world to restore territorial integrity. Ukraine is not a state because it has no history. Its territory was formed by accident. The Crimea, the south, and the east have no historical Ukrainian roots, support of its territorial integrity is pointless because it contradicts history. Of course, what is the most important in informational war, Russian propaganda makes full use of both the forms and meanings of Soviet war propaganda. The Kremlin assures that this modern war against Ukraine is not an aggression against neighboring state, but continuation of struggle against fascists who threatened Russia and the world. Now the center of fascist evil is not Berlin, but a much closer city that was captured by Nazis, Kyiv. Therefore, the main goal of Putin's so-called military operation announced in February 24 is denazification. This worked perfectly for the Russian audience, where the Great Patriotic War and Great Victory have become the state quasi-religion, where millions of people participate in government-organized annual rituals on May 9th, where modern films and internet sites update all Soviet myths. For a while, these myths had a significant impact on a part of Ukrainian population, which continued to view the Second World War through the prism Soviet-Russian propaganda, even after 1991. This allowed Russia to mobilize part of our citizens for the fight against Ukraine, to influence political forces who were the spokesman of Russian narrative, preserved it by planting it in the legislative field. However, unfortunately for Kremlin, the potential of this propaganda is running out. Ukrainians have a different view of Second World War from the Russians, and their own symbols and own tradition of commemorating its victims and heroes are emerging. The red poppy instead of St. George ribbon, the May 8 instead of the May 9, the Day of Remembrance and Reconciliation instead of Victory Day. The heroes of the past of Ukrainians are the main anti-heroes of Soviet and Russian narratives, the Bandera members. Their symbols, greetings, songs, awards have become an official part of armed forces of Ukraine. October 14 is celebration of creation of Ukrainian insurgent army became a national holiday known as Defenders of Ukraine's Day. And paradoxically, one of the main factors that triggered this large-scale social rethinking of the previous war was the current war. Experience related to the current war, which affected millions of Ukraine, exposed the lies about the previous war, formed them to look at it differently. However, myths about the Second World War are used by Russian propaganda not only in Ukraine or in Russia, but also in Europe and the world. Russia monopolized the Red Army victory over fascism, even though millions of Ukrainians and representatives of other nationalities fought in its ranks. Although the defeat of the Nazis was impossible without Western allies. According to the Russian leadership, the victory is indulgence for modern times. We cannot be aggressors because we freed the world from Hitler. Western experts, journalists, and politicians who are often unfamiliar with Ukrainian history believe Russian thesis about the threat of Ukrainian fascism because they saw Bandera's red and black flags among the Ukrainian soldiers. Unfortunately, the history of Bandera himself, a prisoner of national concentration camp and victim of Soviet propaganda and ultimately a victim of KGB killer who killed him in 1949. It is little known as the history of the movement he led. It is impossible to write about this struggle in Soviet times because the USSR was the only anti-fascist country in the world, and all who were against the main anti-fascist Stalin had to be fascist. Today, Russian propaganda offers a similar division of the world. Only the main position of the anti-fascist has now become Putin. Ukrainians who do not agree with Russian policy with Putin have become fascist, especially since in Ukraine, at the state level, the member of Ukrainian insurgent army are honored and who were fascists if Russian propaganda is to be believed. Accusing the Ukrainian liberation movement in collaboration and in Holocaust became one of the key plots of discrediting Ukraine in the international stage. Politicians unfamiliar with Ukrainian history pick this up and spread this thesis. For example, President of Israel Rivlin in 2016 in his speech in Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine during state events commemorating the victims of Baban Yar. Similar statements are heard even from some American politicians. Quoting, among the groups and individuals who are glorified in Ukraine, there are Nazi collaborators, Stefan Bandera, Roman Zhukhevich, and Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, as well as Ukrainian Insurgent Army. This is quote from a letter from more than 15 members of US Congress to State Department aimed at putting diplomatic pressure upon Ukraine over state-sponsored anti-Semitism in Ukraine. The spread of Russian myths about the Ukrainian liberation movement is facilitated by politically engaged historians, mostly with leftist views, or even our supposedly impartial colleagues who are not ready to revise their own established views. Legitimizing aggressive action, mobilizing its supporters and discrediting Ukrainians in the war are not the only functions of history for Putin in this war. He is sure that correctly rewriting history is an important tool for victory over Ukraine. It is capable of reshaping Ukrainians to its needs. He is guided by the aphorism attributed to Bismarck: war is won not by generals, but by school teachers and parish priests. This is why he needs Russian Orthodox priests and teachers with correct history textbooks in Ukraine. Books in which Stalin is described as effective manager have been distributed in Russia for 20 years. The justification of communist totalitarian regime has long been seen in history books. They help shape the current Russian society, which supports Putin's as continuation of Stalin policy. The society is ready to turn a blind eye to the government's crimes against its own and other citizens. Generation of those who killed in Irpin, Bucha, Izium, and still kill in Kherson and Mariupol were educated by these textbooks. Replacing history textbook in Russian occupied territories of Ukraine is one of the first steps of a new government. This was also in the case of in Crimea since 2014, and in so-called DNR-LNR, they immediately began developing the history of fatherland courses. During the summer of this year, school teachers from Russia were sent en masse to the occupied territories of Ukraine. Their task is to raise Russians from young Ukrainians. And even in areas that were occupied by Russians for only a few months, I mean Kyiv, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy Oblast, and did not have time to prepare their own books, and they began to remove Ukrainian historical literature from the libraries and destroy them. To do this, Russian units of military police were brought in, who, in addition to repressive functions, performed ideological ones. The Russians are in a hurry because they understand that they are late with the historical education of young Ukrainians, which has been happening for the past 30 years almost without their participation. Their attempts to impose a common vision of the past has failed. In the few years after the declaration of independence, historians and teachers in Ukraine managed to create a complete set textbook of history of Ukraine from the earliest times to the present. Our state became the first among the post-Soviet republics to provide educational institutions with their own history textbooks. And this success played a very important role in the formation of national identity of young citizens of Ukraine. Currently, despite the colossal numerical and technical advantage, Russia cannot defeat Ukraine because wars are not won by generals, but by history teachers. And Ukrainian teachers managed to raise a whole generation of citizens and patriots of their country, who are now defending our freedom with weapons in their hands. And they will definitely win, writing their glorious pages in our new history book. And I'm sure that Russian attempts to use all historical myths, along with the use of outdated weapons and anarchic methods of warfare, will soon be considered the reason for its complete defeat in the war against Ukraine. Wars of the past versus wars of the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Volodymyr. Walter, how much time do we have?
We got about
5. Okay, let me jump in then with the first question. I actually have a question to Lubomyr. Could you tell us a little bit, I'm not sure whether you're following this, but how Moscow is trying to divide Ukrainians and Jews, particularly in the diaspora. As you know, the term Nazi in Russia is something very different to what it means in the West. I mean, for us, Nazi means the Holocaust. For them, it means the Nazi occupation, the slaughter of Russians during World War II. In fact, anything that's so-called Russophobe is Nazi. So, but in terms of Jewish-Ukrainian relations, has this been affected in some ways? I mean, the fact that the president is Ukrainian president is of Jewish heritage, I presume, prevents that sort of stereotype taking root in Western Jewish organizations.
As I mentioned, I think the very fact that President Zelensky is of Jewish heritage and has demonstrated his valor and his leadership, somewhat to our surprise, I suspect, if I'm honest about it, but nevertheless, has clearly done so, has blunted the allegation that this is a Nazi state or full of extreme nationalists who need to be eliminated. It has had a clearly positive impact on the Jewish diaspora, which I think, along with many of our other fellow citizens, whether in Canada or the United States, have rallied behind Ukraine. I have never in my 70 years seen so many people speaking positively about things Ukrainian. So, and I think we all sense that. That said, I think the fundamental story of Operation Payback has still not been well understood. That when Ukrainians in Soviet Union began working with Jewish refuseniks and began Ukrainian dissidents and Jewish refuseniks working together to challenge the Soviet state, the KGB in alarm launched Operation Payback. We don't know when it began, sometime in the 1970s, but their whole purpose was to split apart the Jewish and Ukrainian diasporas and the Baltic states as well in the West to undermine any prospect of cooperation. And that still resonates to this day. There is no doubt in my mind that that infection continues to pollute relations between Jews and Ukrainians, which is a tragedy. It's a tragedy. I just want to mention that Professor Vyatrovych and I have, after almost a decade of work, completed a book on KGB documents dealing with OUN and UPA. You were all given a little flyer about it, being published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2 or 3 months. We've just finished work on it. It will appear soon, and it is based on Soviet documents about OUN and UPA, some of them captured from OUN and UPA and some Soviet in origin, and it refutes many of these myths. But take a look, it's 1,127 pages. You know, it's a big book. It's a serious piece of scholarship, but how many people will read it? How many people will go through that kind of thing? So I think that the understanding of Jewish-Ukrainian relations in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe before, during, and after the Second World War, polluted as it was by the Soviets and by their fellow travelers in the West. And there are people in the West who collaborated with the Soviets in promoting these negative stories. It's going to take a very, very long time to eradicate. As I said, I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime.
Thanks much.
But I need interpreter for my answer. Yeah, okay. Я теж займався цією темою, і якраз мені здається, що тематика тих спецоперацій КГБ з провокації українсько-єврейських непорозумінь прекрасно розкривається якраз завдяки документам КГБ. Я бачив десятки, можливо, не сотні, але десятки справді документів, які показують, яким чином здійснювалися ці спецоперації. От фрагмент однієї з таких спецоперацій розповідав щойно Лубомyr Luciuk. Я можу згадати такі операції, починаючи з 59-го року. Одна з перших була присвячена інспірації звинувачень вояків батальйону Нахлігалів в участі в єврейському погромі у Львові в 1941 році. Маємо цілий масив документів, який дуже чітко показує, як ця легенда була інспірована КГБ, як готувалися свідки, як готувався весь цей судовий процес. Тим не менше, минуло десятки років, цей міф продовжував жити. І навіть коли десь в 2008 чи 2009 році я вперше оприлюднив ці документи, це не заважає, на жаль, дуже багатьом медіа повторювати цей міф досі. Попри те, що є всі документи, які показують, що все це було абсолютно вигадано від початку до кінця КГБ, тобто це була просто вистава. Є надзвичайно цінні документи, які показують, що співпраця, яка почала залагоджуватися між українцями і євреями в рамках дисидентського руху, власне, вона і мобілізувала КГБ для продовження і активізації цих спецоперацій по поширенню непорозумінь між українцями і євреями. У нас сьогодні в програмі брав участь Йосиф Зісельс. Він є одним з представників, власне, цього єврейського правозахисного руху, який дуже тісно співпрацював в совєтські часи з українським правозахисним рухом, з українським дисидентським рухом. Так от, аби цієї співпраці не було, протягом 70-х років було знову-таки ще кілька спецоперацій, спрямованих на взаємні непорозуміння між українцями і євреями. І в рамках однієї з таких спецоперацій, між іншим, було випущено ті документи, які потім стали основою для дуже гучного скандалу з Дем'янюком тут в Сполучених Штатах Америки. Знову-таки це має безпосередній контакт з діяльністю цієї спецгрупи КГБ, яка виготовляла різного роду фальшиві документи. Є неймовірно цікаві документи. Листівка, зроблена на івриті, англійською і німецькою мовою, з звинуваченням Ярослава Стецька в тому, що він був знову-таки антисеміт і організатор антиєврейських погромів. Листівка, яка поширювалася в тих країнах, де Ярослав Стецько, на той момент 60-70-ті роки, він був президентом антибольшевицького блоку народів, він проводив активну політичну діяльність, і всюди, куди він приїжджав, розкидали ці листівки від імені єврейських організацій. І звідти, скільки поширено таких листівок, ким поширено, де поширено. Цікаві звідти інформація про те, як, на жаль, працювали і через західні медіа, тобто купували журналістів, якимось чином приваблювали журналістів, які проваджували потім потрібні меседжі для КГБ, і КГБ потім в своїх звітах писало, що нами просунуто такі-то тези в таких-то медіа, прогресивна громадськість Сполучених Штатів Америки отримала правильну інформацію. Інформація про Майкла Ганусяка, який довгий час тут сприймався як просто лівий активіст Сполучених Штатів Америки, так от інформація про те, що точно був агентом КГБ і виконував доручення КГБ. Відтак мова не про його якісь ліві погляди, а мова про його співпрацю на Совєтський Союз. Тобто і безліч такої інформації, яку можна і треба шукати, і, слава Богу, вже є доступ в архівах КГБ. Тому запрошую всіх користатися цими документами. Між іншим, коротко ці сюжети викладені ще в одній україномовній книзі «Історія з грифом секретна», де є окремий розділ, який називається «Кухня антисемітизму від КГБ». Можете познайомитися.
Thank you, Volodymyr. I don't think we have time for a translation, but it's encouragement for everybody to learn Ukrainian. So we have one question here.
It's, I think, unfortunate that the format of our gathering doesn't really allow for discussion. I mean, we're having this straight kind of statements and maybe one question here or there. So I'm going to at least throw out discussion pieces because they've been bothering me all day. Strategy and tactics. Virtually everyone in this room, I'm sure, agrees with the strategy, that is the goals, that Ukraine needs to be victorious in a war, all if its territory has to be returned to its pre-2014 boundaries, obviously Crimea, as if this is somehow special. And then one can have a discussion about the future. What is the role, when I talk now about strategy, we can agree on, what about tactics? The tactics are, first of all, the role of the diaspora. I mean, after all, most of the people sitting in this room actually are either diaspora people or simpaticos from the Washington world who come and go out of the room after they do their little stint. What we heard from Professor Luciuk, I found incredibly encouraging because it says something about the Ukrainian diaspora back then. They had nothing. They had no financial means. They had limited linguistic means. And yet everything depended on them to get the word out to the North American public that Ukrainians existed, even existed. Canada's situation wasn't as bad, United States, there were no Ukrainians. We know that. So this was quite difficult. Everything fell on the shoulders of the diaspora. Today, you don't have to do that. That task is being taken over by the American, Canadian, and Western public at large. So therefore, what is left for the diaspora to do? Is it left for, well, is it left for the diaspora to carry on discussions like this and many others? Or should the only role of the diaspora to be at this particular moment, collect money and get that money for those vests, for those goggles, for all the other things that actually international support and American support doesn't get down onto the ground. Ukrainian soldiers on many fronts still don't have the right equipment. That, to my mind, is what the tactics need to be now. And we don't need to sit here and preach to the choir and talk to ourselves, because we're all of the same opinion. I mean, have we learned something really new? Have we changed our views as a result of today? I don't think so. The second thing is then the role of history. We've heard the role of history being used all day today, how important it is, but we're slipping. Virtually everyone slipped into allowing Putin to set the agenda. So we're reacting to what he says, what the Russians say. And we have to somehow justify that Crimea was part of Ukraine, it was never part of Russia forever. We have to justify we don't have to justify anything. Don't let him set the agenda. We should be setting the agenda. And we set the agenda by writing our understanding of this part of the world without, who cares what he says? Who cares what he thinks? We tell the story from our perspective, and it's our role to get that out as widely as possible. So for instance, and by the way, there are other people who have done this in the past. I've been working in an area representing certain groups who didn't exist. We told our story without caring about the enemy, and in the end, we won. We've heard today even about, the multinational, the multicultural component of Ukraine, as if this is something new. There are major histories that deal with this, and that are used, and that are taught. Crimea, Crimea has something to offer. There's a major history, or a history of Crimea published a few years ago in 4 languages.
I don't want to interrupt.
I'm finished, by the way.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm finished, but I'm sorry that I wanted to transform this into some kind of discussion and not just answer and say.
Yeah,
But that, I'll finish on that note.
Thank you very much for that. I just want to, I don't want to cross Walter. I always follow his instructions very closely. So I think we'll stop there, Walter, right? We're going on to the next panel. So I don't want to take time. Let me just say in conclusion, thank you very much to our two panelists. Very enlightening. I certainly learned a good deal from both of them. Let me just conclude by saying that we're bound to be returning to the subject of disinformation, historical distortion, and identity theft in the future. What you said about Putin, you cannot ignore somebody that the West is listening to. You've got to counter him in some way. And that's I think, part of our mission. And maybe after Ukraine's victory on the battlefields and the liberation of all of Ukrainians' territory, and especially when the Russian Federation starts to rupture, Walter, we could also have a session on whatever happened to Russian identity.
Well, no, that was our next year's.
Okay.
I was going to say, Professor Bugajski, stay tuned. We're going to get proactive.
Okay, thank you very much. That's it.
I will, I want to thank everybody, including Dr. Bugajski, because it's always good to hear, the fresh. I thought that every single one of our discussions, including this one, have been actually first rate. And so my attitude is that that I appreciate what you said, the Canadian perspective. We've been doing this for 23 years. We've been hoping that it has made an impact. Professor Bugajski, and there is material outside, incidentally, for those that would want to pick it up, that deals with the World War II issue in a very concrete way. We did something 2 weeks ago in New York on 1942, and we have a whole bunch of documents about people in the Ukrainian underground who were caught in places like Kherson, and it feels like it's 2022, but it was actually about 1942. And this was the Nazis catching our people. And the background at the Institute 2 weeks ago, the background was Russian war crimes. And here we had documents about Germans committing war crimes in Ukraine. I think this more than everybody hears about a Ukrainian issue. And Professor Bugajski, with all respect to you, I think the more that the Ukrainians hear about the issue, not only the folks outside of the Ukrainian community, but even the Ukrainian community, the more they know their own history, the more they'll be able to respond to a lot of the issues. Anyway, I'm going to give 3 minutes of coffee, and then we do have to get that next panel up. If I may even do that as 2 minutes of coffee, because I think the next panel is a very important panel for us. I just have to find out if we know that Professor Blocky is in. Is Ms. Hopko in? You are? Melinda, we wanted to tell you she is. Okay. For those that need coffee, please, and then in about 2 minutes, we